Explosive Enterprises Video Planning Department. Yeah, Explosive Enterprises. No videos on 40mm shells. That doesn't make much sense. We're Explosive Enterprises. We should have tons of videos on 40mm shells. Yeah. Can I give you a quick call back? Thanks. Shit. Hey there, and welcome to Explosive Enterprises. Believe it or not, we're actually taking a look at some explosives today with a unique 40mm grenade from 40 Max, the Cyclops. Jokes aside, the main reason that we don't talk all that much about 40mm grenade shells is that there really isn't all that much to say about them. Manufacturers have largely been following the same mosquito mold / Craft Appleworks 40mm grenade design for around 30 years now. That consists of a plug valve masquerading as the primer of the shell, BBs being stored either in a central cavity or in a series of barrels around the outside of the grenade, and gas being stored where the BBs aren't. We've used quite a few different brands of shells over the years, and while you can sometimes differentiate them when it comes to build quality and reliability, performance-wise, any shell following that 30-year-old design is going to perform pretty much the same way, with exceptions made for shells that can take CO2. All that being said, manufacturers occasionally do come up with some really innovative ideas for 40mm shells. Not all of these are terribly effective, and more often than not they end up in obscurity, either due to being just plain goofy, or sometimes because of moronic, self-sabotaging advertising campaigns. On the other hand, you have things like tag innovation shells, which, without exaggeration, have changed how a lot of milsim games are played. 40 Max shells fall somewhere in the middle. While they aren't game changers like tag shells are, they do put an innovative spin on BB launching 40mm shells, performance and design-wise. So let's get into it. The Cyclops is based around a pretty clever system, which is basically the simplest possible design for an airsoft gun. You have a source of gas, a valve, and a barrel. BBs fill up the barrel, the valve opens up, and the gas forces all the BBs out. With a straight barrel, you can only get a small number of BBs into a system like this before the barrel becomes impractically long. With 6mm BBs, your barrel would have to be at minimum 600mm or around 2 feet long to fit 100 BBs. The clever solution here is to make your barrel as compact as possible by turning it into a coil shape, which effectively fits it into the tube shape of a 40mm shell, and then having that very last portion of the coil straightened out to act as a barrel. This is exactly what the Cyclops does, as you can see when you take the outer shell off. Now, for better or worse, probably worse, this is the exact same system used by the Airsoft Innovations 40 mic. But before pulling out the pitchforks and calling for this thing to be banned, let's take a look at a couple of design features that help make the Cyclops far less heinous than the 40 mic. For starters, the barrel is about half the length of the one on the 40 mic, since unlike the 40 mic, where BBs feed down to the base of the shell and then up through a barrel that runs along the length of it, the BBs feed up from the bottom and into a short barrel at the top. While this isn't the most efficient use of space in terms of BB capacity, the capacity is still perfectly acceptable at 100 BBs, and the power is much lower. Additionally, the barrel on the Cyclops is square rather than cylindrical. This has the effect of deliberately allowing gas to bypass the BBs rather than imparting more energy on them. While this is extremely efficient, it is deliberately inefficient, and further reduces power to the point that BBs coming out of the Cyclops have very similar amounts of energy to those coming out of a normal 40mm shell. Back to some of the more traditional grenade components, the valve is a typical plug valve as seen on most 40mm shells, but scaled down slightly and with 3 bearings instead of 4, which doesn't seem to impact the function at all. For comparison, we've got an old classic Army plug valve, and as you can see, it's a good bit larger. Dimensionally, you're looking at 39.9mm wide at the base, 43mm wide at the rim, and it is slightly longer than a normal 40mm shell at 107mm, so make sure to factor that in when it comes to launcher compatibility. As mentioned, the Cyclops holds 100 BBs and can easily be loaded with the speed loader, which is another big advantage of this coil style of shell, as anyone who's spent a half hour filling a combat load of traditional multi-barrel shells can attest. It's also worth noting that all of the pressure-bearing parts are made of either plastic or fairly thin aluminum, so you definitely don't want to be loading this with CO2. In terms of maintenance on these shells, we'd recommend the usual super lube on these 3 pressure-bearing O-rings, and occasionally some white lithium grease for the bearings. This 4th O-ring is actually not a pressure-bearing O-ring, but is there to retain the BBs, and provides a hop-up effect, so we would generally avoid lubricating that. Performance-wise, it just barely manages to reach out to 100 feet without needing to elevate the launcher, which is actually not bad for a 40mm shell, but the velocity on those BBs is astonishingly low. The 0.2 gram BBs we had loaded here took a full second to reach our 100-foot target, and while something with this kind of ROF is difficult to accurately chrono, I'd expect the muzzle velocity to be somewhere between 100 and 200, leaning towards the lower end of that range. At maximum range, the spread is considerably narrower than what you'd get on a normal 40mm shell, and with 100 BBs filling that space, your shot density is very good, provided you hold it on the target, since there is actually a short delay between the first and last BBs leaving the shell. So, are they practical? Yeah, maybe? The range advantage of the Cyclops over a normal 40mm shell is mostly due to the BB retention O-ring acting as a crude fixed hop-up. Unfortunately, much like the hop-up on a normal airsoft replica, its function is reliant on the system being oriented with the hop-up directly above the BB, and any deviation from that will cause the BB to hook to the left or to the right. Keeping something with a rifle or pistol's ergonomics mostly level isn't particularly difficult, but it can be very annoying to quickly load a 40mm shell in a precise orientation with no obvious reference point for what the correct orientation is. And unfortunately, you don't even have to load the shells that far off axis for them to take some pretty hilarious, but very useless flight paths. To make it easier to line up, you can use a paint pen or metallic sharpie to indicate the correct position for the shell to be in, and then make sure that the line is at the 12 o'clock position when you load the shell. This does require you to pay an annoying amount of attention to the loading process, and can somewhat limit your situational awareness, which isn't ideal. The other issue is the lack of power. While it does save you from injuring someone, unlike the 40 mic, it also negates the range advantage of the Cyclops, since getting hits on an aware target when the BB just sort of saunter towards them isn't going to be likely. And if you're trying to use these shells at close range, as we sort of ended up doing, the accuracy actually makes them harder to use compared to traditional 40mm shells, which have a very wide spread even at close range. It seems like the use case for this shell would be shooting at targets that are outside of the effective range of a normal 40mm BB shell, say 50-ish feet, but not more than the maximum range of the Cyclops, about 100 feet away. In situations where the target is unaware of you, and when it wouldn't just make more sense to engage them with your primary weapon, like if you were using a standalone launcher. Now, to be fair, that isn't an impossible scenario, but does it happen often enough to justify carrying one of these on your grenade belt? We'll let you decide. So, conclusions. On the plus side, the coil design is much less annoying to reload than a traditional shell, and that is definitely a factor to consider, because as anyone who's had to reload more than 3 of those things at a time can tell you, it's pretty annoying. Additionally, it also fires on a much flatter ballistic trajectory than a traditional 40mm shell, with increased range, pushing out to around 100 feet with the launcher held level, which is about as good as it gets with BB firing 40mm rounds. And compared to other shells in the coil category, it doesn't have nearly as much power, so it isn't going to set rentals on fire or get you immediately banned from a field like some other shells might. As for downsides, the biggest problem that we can see is the need to carefully orient the shell when loading. Ideally, you can load a weapon by muscle memory without losing situational awareness by needing to watch the entire process by eye. Unfortunately, there really just isn't a good solution for that with this shell. We know it's a bit weird to complain about since it was just a positive point like 30 seconds ago, but for a shell that is oriented more towards long range, it needs just a little bit more power than it currently has. It doesn't need to be as strong as a 40 mic, but strong enough to make it a bit more practical in its niche. Related to the previous point, and this is an issue with all of the 40 max shells, it can't take CO2. Of all the shells that we've run, the big feature that really elevates performance is the ability to take CO2, and I'd imagine that with gaseous CO2, you'd be able to get some great performance out of a shell like this, without having enough power to really hurt someone. We're going to be experimenting with some 3D printed coil-style heads for the Avengers shell bases, which are CO2 compatible, so keep your eyes out for that. When it comes to 40mm rounds, price is a very legitimate concern, since you want to be carrying a good number of shells at once to make effective use of them. The Cyclops will run you $45 from AliExpress, which seems to be where 40 max sells them directly, and they can be found in the US for around $55. So not really doing you too many favors value-wise, but cheaper than a 40 mic or a master mic if you can even manage to find one, so there is that. On the whole, while it might not be the most practical shell out there, I do appreciate 40 Max for being one of the few designers in the 40mm shell space that is trying out new things, which will always get our attention at the very least. Let us know what you think of these kinds of reviews that step away a little bit from the gas blowback content. We have a pretty extensive collection of odd 40mm shells and grenades, so if this is the kind of content you want to see more of, or if you have any questions, let us know in the comments below. And if you're interested in supporting us further, you can pick up a t-shirt or a patch on our merch store at xeairsoft.com. Thanks for watching.